Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This is episode 53. We're going to be talking about the Ivan Reitman Ghostbusters from 1984. And to prepare you, our next episode, we're going to be talking about the documentary Hail Satan, directed by Penny Lane from 2019. It's actually still in the theaters. Really quick, something we normally leave to the end of the episode, which is like viewer mail, at scarythoughts.org. Monique, who was on our Suspiria episode, actually wanted to follow up with a few thoughts, and you have to run out the door soon, right? So we're going to get you on the top end of this episode. So if you listened to our Suspiria episode, here's an apologia from Monique.
Apologia, dear listeners, for the Suspiria episode. Just that at the end of our long conversation about Suspiria, when I think Chad asked me what my favorite film dance moments were, I completely forgot about the existence of Bob fucking Fosse.
How dare you?
How dare I? And anyway, just check out the oeuvre of Bob Fosse. I forgot about the existence of my favorite dance moments, courtesy of Cabaret and Sweet Charity, the Mine Hair number, which is the best ever, and the Hey Big Spender number, which is also the best ever. They're both the best ever. So, and also just watch Fosse Verdon because it's really great. It's going on right now.
The TV show that's on some
FX. FX.
Yeah.
Yes, it's on FX right now. It's fabulous. And I also wanted to propose, didn't we propose this, a little Scary Thoughts drinking game or something?
Yeah, it has come up that there should be a Scary Thoughts drinking game, which is a pretty good idea, but I think you had a few good squares to add. We'll make one, but you should start off what should be on the card.
I mean, I think first for sure, just anytime Chad mentions Fight Club is a place to start.
A classic film.
Precisely.
Perhaps the most important ever filmed.
Sure.
And maybe also drink when the qualifier classic best ever is added to Fight Club. Just the qualifiers reminding us how fabulous Fight Club is. I guess feminism would be a good time to drink.
Yeah, that comes up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Performance art would be a good time.
Yeah.
And wait, there was one more thing.
Black Flag.
Oh yeah, Black Flag.
Chad mentions Black Flag as sort of like an example of how great things can be with minimal means.
Yeah.
Right. No, that's good. That's
to me,
good.
it's like where creativity, passion, and budget meet is Black Flag.
Which is often, with the history of horror movies, very similar because, American hardcore and American slasher films in the 80s both sort of have very similar trajectories. Mm-hmm. They don't intersect much, but they're definitely very in parallel.
Yeah, and Black Flag also has the problem of remakes and sequels and reboots and different casts.
I know nothing about Black Flag, so I'm going to use that as my parting moment. And thanks for having me on for a moment to give you some viewer mail from the next room. Bye, guys.
Bye. Thanks for joining us.
Yay. I wish you were talking about Lady Ghostbusters, but I guess I understand. I'm sure it'll come up.
We'll be discussing that film.
It'll come up.
And actually, that's a good moment to... we still have here in the intro a few things to get through, but I am tempted to say... let's not talk about the new Ghostbusters, or do we have to? Because you and I already argued about it for over an hour today. I wonder if I think I'm done.
Well, I think I have my opinion on it pretty distilled from that conversation. And I don't want to take away from talking about what is so great about the first Ghostbusters and why it's successful and why people remember it. But I feel like decisions made in the new Ghostbusters, completely removed from any of the controversy around it or any of the misandrist internet trolls or any of that stuff, it's actually really useful to see what works in one film and a similar version of it done very poorly in another film. I think it's very interesting and instructive for like comedy in general.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
cool. All right. So really quick, you can email us at whatthe@scarythoughts.org about anything in particular. Do you have anything to plug?
I don't.
Me neither. Sign up for our newsletter, scarythoughts.org, top right corner. Give us your info. We email out with every episode. And last thing, spoilers ahead. We're not reviewing Ghostbusters. You've already seen it. If you haven't, get right to it. Okay, so where do we want to start with this so beloved film?
Yeah. Well, do you love this film?
I don't love this film. I really like this film. I don't have a thing for this film, but I really enjoyed rewatching it, laughed a lot. There's some really interesting choices. I think there's so much about it that's really solid. But to me, it really is. It's just a movie. Oh, and I should say, in our last episode, I think I made the comment, we're not talking about the new improved Ghostbusters. We're going to be talking about the 1984 version. And I sort of did it in this very Canadian deadpan way. And people took me seriously that I thought the new one was better. This is not the case.
You can try and walk this back all you want, but we know the truth.
I'll just say, I quite like the new one. I thought it was pretty funny. Not a great movie, but not awful either, but it is in no estimation better or comes close to the original, which is fine. But yeah, sorry I was too dry about that. To me, it was just so obviously not true that I didn't try to go like JK. Anyway, yeah. So Ghostbusters 1984, great movie, super fun. It's just a movie though. I have no desire to like uphold it as an example of perfect comedy or anything like that.
Yeah, I quite enjoy this film. I think I was just young enough to be completely enraptured with this movie. I mean, this is the kind of movie, and you see it even more so in Ghostbusters 2. It's just made for little kids to run around and imitate.
For sure.
I think one of the things that's so pleasurable about the opening of Stranger Things 2 and the trailers when they pop on and it's Halloween and they're dressed up like Ghostbusters and they have good Ghostbusters costumes. Because I remember it was so fun to like just put on like a gas station type suit and run around with like a vacuum cleaner and just pretend to be a Ghostbuster. And, you know, they made pretty good toys.
Really?
Yeah, like especially for Ghostbusters 2, you could get like a kid-sized proton pack. You could get the Ecto-1 car, which is pretty cool. I had the car.
Cool.
Yeah, there was just cool toys for it, and it let you get really into their universe. And then there was the cartoon, The Real Ghostbusters. So it had a moment in the way that like the early 80s, whenever there was a cartoon in the early 80s, it just overwhelmed with all the merchandise and everything and the breakfast cereal.
Yeah. So Ghostbusters as a property to release toys is obviously very limited. There's only so much you can have. It doesn't have this big universe to draw from. Do you think that that's in the end good or bad for being a kid? And like if you are into G.I. Joe, there are dozens of action figures that you can bring in and vehicles and sets. But with Ghostbusters, there's only a limited. So you can play Ghostbusters plus G.I. Joe plus He-Man. Is that better, or is it better when you've got a complete universe to...
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you think about the cartoon, there definitely was an expanded kind of universe. And also like the film itself, like the mythology of the film, it sort of asks a bunch of questions. Like, you know, when Gozer asks, are you a god? Okay, well, what other kind of gods are out there? Like, you know, the original version of this movie was going to be like $300 million, and it was just going to be like giant monster and god after giant monster and god, like just this whole series of fighting him. Like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man shows up in like 20 minutes into the movie in the original draft of it. And so there definitely seemed to be this huge expanded universe. And I think Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis had it in mind because what they were working on right before this was a Hitchhiker's Guide film. And so the idea of like this huge expanded universe, I think probably was in mind.
I can also see an overlap with comedy fantasy between those two things for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's easy to forget because the special effects are so like, I guess, quaint and practical for our times. But this was a really credible science or a really credible special effects movie. It was very expensive at the time, and the effects were really, really advanced. And I think that's one of the things that makes this movie so different from a lot of other movies is the ghost and stuff, especially the first 10 minutes of film. It's very credible. Like that whole sequence is, if you were to take out the comedy beats, probably as scary as anything that was in Phantasm or Poltergeist or something like that, especially when, Up to the Librarian, you could have made that much creepier without the joking.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that's cool about this movie is it always takes the supernatural element seriously. It's like this consistent straight man in the film.
Right. I think for me, rewatching this now it's interesting to view the Ghostbusters as a tech startup. It was really hard for me not to view it that way because they start off working in a university and they get kicked out and they go and get a big space to do their startup company, and they just sort of have some technology and a crazy dream and barely any funding. You pointed out that their office space is an open plan office because they take over a fire station.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the whole fail, what's the fucking refrain? The tech startup refrain? Fail fast, fail often.
Oh, move
whatever.
fast and break things.
Yeah.
I mean,
that whole thing that's totally the Ghostbusters motto.
Yeah. It's interesting how you can read entrepreneurship a little differently from then to now. He gets Ray gets a mortgage on his house to make this happen, you know, and it's it's an early 80s predatory lending. It's 19% or something crazy like that. And I definitely feel where you pick up the startup sort of thing, but it's actually, in some ways, they're just schlubbier, like later on in the film when they describe themselves as exterminators. That's kind of definitely, more the feel. And it was one of the misses, I think, of the new film, the Lady Ghostbusters movie, is it could have had that sort of critique, they're a little bit more of a startup, and it would have given the film a lot more of a modern humorous edge. Imagine a little bit of Silicon Valley in that movie, and I think it would have been, people would have thought it was really fresh and really funny. In the way that, who knows if this is going to be the case, but I saw the trailer for the new Chucky movie, the new Child's Play reboot come out, and it leans really heavily on this Internet of Things idea where the Chucky doll is connected to an app and it's connected to the devices in your home, and the movie could be a piece of shit.
All the Chucky movies are great. They're all so smart.
Yeah,
so
they're very innovative.
It's probably going to be solid.
Yeah, and I just remember looking at it going, oh, wow, it's picking up something new in the air and making it part of the whole franchise. And I think that it was I think anybody would have found the humor of a startup added to Ghostbusters to be super funny because it's right there.
Yeah. Yeah. But you and I being young when it came out, I wonder how that reflected the time. Obviously, it's a completely different thing, starting a company in the early 80s, but that was the rise of Reagan's reign, and I don't know.
Yeah, this is a movie that would indoctrinate you into an anti-government sympathy.
Yes.
I for sure just have a natural antagonism to the government. It's just, I don't know if it's just being Southern or what, but it's not even, with the way it manifests in me isn't even rational or anything like that. It's just more hilarious, being a Cubs fan forever. You know what I mean? You're just committed to this outlook and there's just no changing it. You can move through life better or worse. You can make better or worse decisions, for instance, if I would decided to be a sovereign citizen and not pay taxes, it would probably fuck me up, and that's the logical, that's the logical endpoint to all this nonsense. But in this film, the EPA is a perfect villain, but this is exactly the kind of business you would want them to shut down.
Oh, totally. I find that's sort of a beautiful part of this film, actually, is how antagonistic it is towards bureaucratic pencil pushers, but he's right. Shutting down the grid is an hysterical bad move by the EPA guy. But otherwise, yep, this is exactly why government oversight should not exist at all.
And the shutting down of the grid thing is kind of weird too, because it's if you showed up at this, even as a little kid, that scene didn't make any sense to me, because it's if you showed up at a nuclear waste facility.
Okay, abruptly, in the middle of talking about ghosts and phantoms, the computer stopped recording, and we don't know why. And so we were talking for about a half hour.
Yeah, we were visited by the ghost of a karate school that was unhappy with our discussion of how lame karate is.
Yeah. So we're going to wind our way back to that, but let's pick up when you left off before the poltergeist meddled with my MacBook Pro.
Yeah, so what we were talking about, we were talking about a lot of stuff, but what we were talking about when we stopped recording was when the EPA guy throws off the switch of the containment unit.
Yeah.
You wouldn't go into a nuclear facility that was operating poorly and just kick over a can of toxic waste and be like, fuck you guys. Like, you wouldn't do that. So it's interesting, like the Ghostbusters, they're clearly in violation of the law, right? And the devices that they have are so dangerous that you kind of would want a government oversight of them in some way. But the problem that they're solving, which is paranormal activity, it's unsolvable by the government, I would assume, right? So who are you going to call, Mark?
Jesus. Yeah, for sure. I'm just going to put this out there, how Venkman is a sexual predator. I'm just going to bring it up. It probably doesn't bear discussion, but he is more than just a creep. He's manipulative towards women, doesn't seem to respect their boundaries.
So here's an interesting question I have about that is, in the context of a comedy where somebody's supposed to be ham-fisted and there's stereotypes and characters and he's like a ladies' man who like is trying too hard, is that okay for a comedy character? Is it like a Pepe Le Pew sort of thing? Or, is it just not allowed? Like, for example, I don't think you could have that now as a character.
I think what is troubling, and this is a sort of thing I always come back to when thinking about representation in cinema, is it's not so much what's being depicted, it's how it plays out. So someone's a sexual predator and they get the woman in the end.
Yeah.
Fuck that. Someone's a sexual predator and they're a sexual predator. Yeah, right. They're in the world, so they should also be in our mythology.
Right. But there's something else that's kind of going on in this movie, which is like he is a PhD in psychology and parapsychology. So presumably he would be very, very good at manipulating people. Like he probably went to school to learn how to do it, right? And I almost think of him as kind of like those dudes like the pickup artists, like the game. Like he would be like
Neil
very
Strauss.
he would be like a very high level ghost professor version of like the game. And what's kind of weird is like Sigourney Weaver's character is clearly like a catch, right? She has a cool job. She's in the orchestra. She has a very expensive apartment, successful, doesn't seem to tolerate any of the dorks that are around her fawning over. Like she rejects Loomis, her neighbor. She kind of rejects the guy who's one of the best musicians in the world that she's kind of hanging out with. And she ends up sort of going for Peter Venkman. Like she's, he kind of wears her down and wins her over.
Gross.
Yeah.
I guess it's partly how it plays out. And it seems that you often have this litmus test of like, if it's funny, it's funny. I don't agree with that, but let's just use that litmus test. I don't think sexual predation is funny. It's not, I'm not saying it's verboten and like, that's not funny. I just mean like, a creepy guy won't take no for an answer and then he gets the girl in the end. I don't find that charming or funny. And then also, I'm very exhausted by the narrative trajectory of the redemptive creep man, or the man who starts off as a fucking asshole, and then he goes through some stuff and comes out the other end redeemed and gets the girl. And whether the girl is part of the equation or not, that is so much of Hollywood's history. A really grotesque example is Falling Down. Actually, a lot of Michael Douglas movies are like that. But where it's like some asshole has a really tough time, and in the end, it's okay. We love him, and he triumphed, and he overcame obstacles. So he's somehow, the fact that he is a monster doesn't matter so much anymore, and we love him despite it all.
Yeah.
Right? And often we get distracted by that the person's actually going through. We build up sympathy for these characters through their struggle, through the narrative, but it doesn't actually replace internal work, becoming a non-asshole,
Yeah. It's interesting. Like Falling Down's an interesting example because that movie's way better than people probably remember or give it credit for, and one of the main reasons why it's so good is as much as you kind of sympathize with the Michael Douglas character, like the Falling Down character, his arc slips into like explicit villainy and he's not redeemed at the end of it. It's interesting. Like he's not just like, I had a hard day and I blew some stuff up and gave some thugs the what for. Like it's not like like Gran Torino, for example, like that movie kind of positions this misanthropic old racist as like a hero at the end. Yes. It's the same as any race apology movie, like Driving Miss Daisy or whatever the fuck. It's the same thing. Whereas at Falling Down, the character is ground down by the city of LA and dies because of it, which I think makes him a more interesting and more tragic character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Ghostbusters, ghostbusting, and the reality of an It's hard not to compare Ghostbusters to The Conjuring, the real life of Ed and Lorraine Warren, and the fiction that they brought upon the world. And it kind of makes me wonder if any of the Ghostbusters writing was based on Ed and Lorraine Warren, because they'd been around.
Yeah.
By that point. And
well, I imagine probably some of it because, one, Dan Aykroyd's a total freak about this stuff. He's super into the paranormal and aliens especially, and there's a really funny interview with him where he's talking about how his kids ask him, they're like, Daddy, are these ghosts really, real, or is this just a make-believe? And he, in all seriousness, goes, and then, most people would say, oh, it's just make-believe, but I can't tell them a lie. And I say, it's real. There are ghosts. And I was like, whoa, it's hilarious to think about that, And I guess he was the most on board with this movie continuing because he's such a fan of ghosts and the paranormal. And actually, I didn't even know this until today, but Bill Murray was the one that cock-blocked it the whole time. Like the reason why there is no like older Ghostbusters 3 is because Bill Murray just wasn't having it. And then Harold Ramis dies. And then that's pretty much a wrap for having the original cast. Although there was an article going around about how they were thinking about bringing him back as a CG character, which would be fucking awful.
No.
Yeah,
that would be
terrible.
Great.
No, it's terrible.
No, that's a great that makes so much sense.
Did I ever tell you about that short story I wrote about they're kind of an evil company that buys the postmortem likeness rights of young film stars, and they're like, hey, we'll give you $1 million now, and when you die, we want to be able to use your young face for movies. But instead what they do is they secretly murder the young actors young, so that it's kind of like a rebel without a cause, like forever young awesomeness, and then make more money off the actor that way.
That's great.
Yeah. And now it's like that shit's probably right on our horizon,
Yeah. So what's your personal experience with the paranormal?
So I have like tried pretty much every mainstream method of seeing a ghost you could possibly find, like lifelong interest in Satanism, the occult, witchcraft. I have seen absolutely nothing that would lead me to believe that there was any sort of supernatural thing out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is a bummer. I would love to see a ghost.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
I think that's actually a common sort of skeptic. I'm not saying you're a skeptic, but that's often a skeptic refrain just in general is like, I'd love for there to be an afterlife. There's no fucking evidence. There's no reason for me to believe it. So until there is, I'm afraid how do you feel about believers in general of any sort?
I
really?
I don't mind it all. Like what I often describe is that I have this sort of like, just like how people just have diabetes and deal with it. I have like a religious feeling and I just deal with it. Like I have just this like just ambient Christianity that goes on in the back. And part of me could just be like a Chris Pratt youth pastor dude with the wrong set of friends, right? But I also don't believe in an interventionist God either. You know what I mean? I think that all these stories are essentially like technologies. They're mythological technologies that allow you to go through your life in some way. And essentially you're basically blinding your brain to the idea that you're going to die one day and you don't have utter despair. And I think if that alone is what's happening, is you're able to go through life and live a better life, it's totally worth believing. But you don't get to make policy based on those beliefs that make you feel better, which is kind of where I fall down on it,
Total agreement.
Yeah.
I also think it's not just a technology for getting through life. I think it's historically been a technology for progressing humanity. If we can in any way think about humanity as improving upon itself, like Christianity's done some pretty amazing things for
it's just a
humanity.
Set of rules to kind of agree with and go throughout your life, and we'll probably talk about the 10 Commandments more on our Hail Satan, because that's the question in episode. But I think, God, I mean, we should get him from the Hail Satan episode. There's a line in the movie where somebody's like, well, why not just be an atheist or whatever? And the guy's like, well, it's just more fun this way. And I think that's like kind of an art call. Like, it's just more fun to live an aesthetic life, and it's a type of way of going through the world that, I mean, I think you could make a case that it's been naturally evolved, sort of, because most of the infrastructure for belief in religion was put together before science was really great. So, it just kind of happens at that point.
Yeah, I think that sort of skepticism is so necessary right now for obvious reasons. We're in the era of anti-vaxxers and flat earthers and Pizzagate, and there's just so much hysteria directed towards these very, very peculiar, idiosyncratic worldviews. And I think one thing that it is quite off topic from Ghostbusters, but not off topic for what skepticism brings up, is this, I think, a fascination you and I have with fake martial arts.
Yeah.
And I think that, thinking about Ghostbusters and thinking about the Warrens, I mean, there's skepticism in Ghostbusters, both 1 and 2, and I don't remember too much about the remake, but there is they're con artists, and of course they're not.
Yeah.
Ed and Lorraine Warren totally are con artists.
But they believe. What's interesting about Venkman is he's kind of the opposite. He's almost more like the Steve Martin character in Leap of Faith, whereas he's playing it all as a laugh and as a goof, and he doesn't really believe in it, but it gets him what he wants, so he kind of plays along. But the moment he's shown like explicit proof that what he's been faking forever is actually real, he sort of becomes a skeptic a little bit. Like when he goes in to look at Dana's apartment and he doesn't see anything or any evidence that like fits his view. Like he's like, man, I've seen a ghost and there's slime. There's no ghost, there's no slime here. So you're probably full of shit. Like he seems like he doesn't believe her, even though he should believe her.
Yeah,
I don't know.
And that happens actually in Ghostbusters too, when the first scene is Dana's baby's pram goes crazy down the street, and she doesn't bring Venkman over; she brings in 2 of the others, and they just say like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And they're just asking really basic questions. And she's like, it's this exchange where she's basically saying, you don't believe me. And he's like, it's not that. It's that the simplest explanation is usually the cause. And that's, it's sort of like that's science.
Right.
Right. But the disproving of supernatural phenomenon, I think, has a really interesting history with The Amazing Randy, which I think you have a better claim to knowing about that history than I.
Yeah, he's a magician, like a stage magician, and he was on like late night shows a lot. Like he was on Carson's show all the time, and he was just kind of a fun guy because he sort of predates Penn and Teller and the I'm a magician, but I'm going to kind of explain what's going on because I want to protect people from being duped. And so he came out and smashed the psychic and cold reader Uri Geller, who was like famous for bending spoons and all this nonsense. And basically, The Amazing Randy came out, bent spoons too, and then set up some parameters that basically blocked Uri Geller's ability to do anything. And it was basically ended that dude's entire career in one shot. And Amazing Randy just continued on. He's just one of these debunker guys, and he has a pretty famous Randy Foundation prize, which is they'll give you $1 million if you can prove anything supernatural in any sort of controlled environment. And so far, no one's been able to claim it.
And I think that's significant. And it's not just like, oh, well, that's just The Amazing Randy. It's like, I mean, we are also in an era of ghost hunters, like the TV shows that are about haunted houses, and they're utter nonsense, and none of it is replicable. None of it is traceable. It's all conjecture.
Yeah. You can buy all that equipment on Amazon. It's awesome. And it's usually like, if you bought this item, will you buy this item? You could be a ghost hunter and with $2,000.
Awesome.
or no grand, really.
And that's, I think, also very parallel to that Chinese MMA fighter who has sort of made it his mission to expose fraudulent martial arts.
Yeah, Zhu Shedong is his name.
Sounds right.
Yeah, I mean, he's interesting because he's doing the McDojo Bushido thing, which we'll explain in a second, but to a country. And his shit, like where he's at, is actually pretty scary. It's probably scarier than the 80s and the Satanic Panic. I mean, he's like taking on, like, the Chinese government. Kung Fu is the national martial art, and there's a lot of national pride tied into the supremacy of that martial art. And this dude comes along and is like, actually, MMA is better, and he'll just challenge straight Kung Fu people and beat the fuck out of them because, you know, his set of skills is actually more practical for like real fights.
Right. I think it might be worth breaking down further. At least I'll say that being someone who spent very little of my life being invested in any sort of combat or violence or anything, I really have found that discovering Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu late in my life and talking about it with people, that almost nobody I ever talk to knows anything about martial arts. Mm-hmm. So it might be worth explaining what we're even talking about, like the context of exposing something in the field of martial arts.
Yeah, like martial arts, what's interesting about it from a scientific perspective is that it's testable. And, you know, you can...
It is a series of techniques that have been developed all around the world by different people, and they've evolved completely different techniques. Mm-hmm. And all of them believe that their techniques have supremacy. I mean, this is even something that if you watch old Chinese martial arts movies, there'll be these moments of like, your monkey's paw is no match for my five-finger death touch, or, you know, and it's sort of like, that's a little sort of slice of like, you have your martial art and I have mine, and my technique, my skill set is better than your skill set. Mm-hmm. And that is a parallel discussion from, I'm a better fighter than you.
Well, that's religion, right? Like, it's like, you know, my particular branch of Christianity is superior to your branch of Christianity.
Yes.
Except for with religion, it's just all falsified. It's like from a certain perspective, right? Like, it's all bad. Like, you can't prove any of the metaphysical elements of any sort of religion. You just can't, or no one has anyway. Like, I mean, maybe somebody will figure it out, but there's not even any infrastructure, and it seems developed. And it seems like any of the infrastructure that people have used to prove psychic phenomenon, it's all bullshit. You know, I mean, probably the most famous one is the fucking Scientology e-meter, which is a total quack device. You know, like, you can go look at the patent and see that it doesn't do anything, but there you are. You know, it has that. But martial arts, the UFC is actually the most significant development in the martial arts probably in the last 1,000 years, because you got to see all these different martial arts under the same rule set, especially in the early days when it would be like, I'm a dude with one boxing glove and you are a Kyokushin karate master and versus a Taekwondo guy. And
it was literally like almost every martial arts style against every other martial arts style. Yeah. So like, you know, you go and learn karate at your karate dojo, you believe that you have this certain skill set and it'll help you in combat situations.
Yeah.
But if the only people you ever train with are other karate people, all you know is what happens when you use your karate against other karate people at your studio.
Yeah. And it's interesting to see how it developed. And it's developed so fast. Like, martial arts has changed so much in the last 30 years. Like, you used to be able to just be a liar and get yourself a karate outfit and a black belt and teach little kids, you know, the basics for how to make a living off that. Like, you know, the Rick Kwon dude in Napoleon Dynamite is a perfect example. You know, somebody who's just like basically lies about what their background was. And then as soon as people saw the UFC and saw certain martial arts just dominating, in particular Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to a certain extent, regular boxing, kickboxing, and Muay Thai, you know, and wrestling, of course. Those martial arts, largely sport-based martial arts, where, you know, people are getting knocked the fuck out. Most of them are Olympic sports. You know, you have thousands of years in some cases with wrestling, with Greco-Roman wrestling, of seeing what does and does not work. And once you mixed those things together, very questionable things like Mantis Kung Fu style were shown to be fraudulent, or I mean, it depends on how you define fraudulent. To me, in martial arts, it's like, can you beat someone up with it? Like that's, if you can't, it's fraudulent.
If it is sort of like a dance, and you know that it's a dance, like capoeira.
Yeah.
There's sort of this, it's kind of deemed a martial art, but people are not fighting with it. So
Yeah.
I sort of feel like that gets a pass. Tai Chi, people mostly do it slowly in a park to raise their chi, and God bless them, whatever.
Yeah.
But to believe any of that shit is actually effective combat is preposterous.
Yeah, and pretty much like once the UFC kind of came out, like the breakout star of the UFC is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like people didn't know what the hell it was in the late 90s, and now there's probably as many Jiu-Jitsu schools as there are yoga studios. What's interesting about Jiu-Jitsu though is it is maintained a standard. There's almost like a scientific standard to it. Like if you're a purple belt, you should be able to go anywhere in the country and smash any blue or white belt. Like you should be able to, otherwise you're not a purple belt. And there would be an exception, like, you're a 40-year-old purple belt and you're going up against a 22-year-old ex-collegiate wrestler blue belt.
Yeah.
You're going to be fucked. Like you might be anyway. You might be good enough to get him or whatever. But I've seen people bowled over by strong people. It just happens, But once more and more people learned how to fight, actually, like they're developed like kind of like a skeptic community around the martial arts. And they founded a website called bullshido.com, which is just basically like 4chan for martial artists. And they started going out and challenging people. Like there was one of the Gracie things, with the Gracie in Action videotapes, they would just have open challenges. So you could be from any martial art and come to any Gracie school and fight, and they would videotape it and show how great Gracie Jiu-Jitsu was. And then people started doing that at an amateur level, which is kind of interesting. It's hilarious watching people who believe in crazy martial arts get fucked up.
Yeah, just Bullshido, and then McDojo Life, which is an Instagram channel, which is just like nonsense martial arts practices. You just watch people just sort of like wave their arms or tap someone on the neck, and then the person passes out, and it only works on believers, and nobody seems to know any better at the dojo.
Yeah.
It's super fascinating.
It's interesting too how it's just something about the human mind that just wants to believe the thing that it's committed to. And it's very difficult to get people off of it. I think it's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to get people out of cults. You're just so invested. You have so much sunk cost into this thing. You see like a lot of people on YouTube, they're kung fu people that are just like passionately defending kung fu. Like it's the greatest martial arts in the world. And it might be the greatest martial art for you. You might personally get a lot out of it. But there's a reason why there are no kung fu experts in the UFC. Like there's just nobody. Like nobody has ever succeeded, other than like every once in a while somebody will do some weird shit like Stylebender, or somebody will come in with some weird like kung fu front kick and do something weird. But like there's no kung fu man dominating the UFC.
What do those people, how does an Aikido or Kung Fu master currently excuse their inability to fight against basic Muay Thai, BJJ techniques?
Well, a lot of times it's the same argument as like faith healing. It's like you don't have enough faith, therefore it didn't work. Or you don't have enough skill, therefore it didn't work. Like there's a pretty popular video going around right now of this guy who's like kind of a long-haired, like loser-looking dude, and he's an Aikido guy.
Yeah,
and
I love him.
yeah, so he goes in, and you have to give him credit.
He's a
like,
black belt.
Yeah, he's a black belt in Aikido, and he's where there's irony is he spent a lot of time on YouTube talking shit about jiu-jitsu and how it's worthless and how like, against an Aikido master like himself. And this is where it gets comedy, is he's saying like himself, like he's putting himself up there as the master. He says like, well, the reason why it doesn't work is it won't even get to the ground. He's like, because his belief is that his system can stop all the things that happen that would put him into trouble. Like, so like, hey, look, jiu-jitsu is all about going to the ground. Just don't go to the ground. Of course not. If you're a bronze medal Olympic wrestler, yeah, like you might have that option to not go to the ground, right? But just some jabroni with a black belt from some mini mall, like no fucking way, dude. So, but he goes and challenges a MMA school, and his reasoning was kind of like actually pretty decent. He's like, well, I just want to see if this works. I'm testing myself in the real world like you're supposed to as a martial artist. And the dude just like open hand, like the guy he's fighting, just open hand pimp slaps him across the face and gives him one leg kick. And he's pretty much done. But he's like, time out. And he resets and he comes back. And the dude just picks him up and slams him on the ground and it's over. I mean, I don't know, what does the Aikido dude do after that?
Well, I've been following him since then.
Have you?
And he is completely dedicated to exposing Aikido as a fraud now.
Wow. See, that's the best case scenario.
Absolutely. He was a total believer and he got schooled, and now he goes to Brazilian jiu-jitsu schools and he'll like talk to black belts and go show them videos of like his masters, the people who taught him, and go like, okay, what's wrong with this technique? Why doesn't it work? And what did I see that help me understand what I believed in?
That is so heartening to hear.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you could not imagine a better case scenario for that dude. And that dude's going to get good. If he spent like 15 years on some bullshit, like he's going to probably dedicate himself to jujitsu.
Oh, yeah, like now he's really motivated.
And that shit used to happen all the time. I mean, like, it's not like time spent doing martial arts, even lame ones, is bad. You just should have that wrapped up by like 13 or 14, you know?
Yeah. Get back to Ghostbusters.
Yeah, let's talk back. Yeah. Speaking of realism, I think one of the things that's cool about Ghostbusters, especially the early ones, is the tech is sort of credible in the way that the Millennium Falcon is credible, because it's kind of beat up and stupid, grimy and shitty. It has like an actual like weight in the film.
Right.
It's not overused either. Like, a lot of people have made the comparison between lightsabers and proton packs. It's like you just use it for a little bit of flavor to kind of build the world. You don't want to go too much with it.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I want to talk about New York City.
Yeah. The Ghostbusters, the original one, really gets like a great glimpse of New York. It's a really like cinematic New York that you just don't get anymore.
It's true. I mean, speaking personally, I totally grew up having like this fetishization of England. I think I listened to mostly British music and loved British films, and so it had this mythology to it, and so did late 70s, early 80s New York City, mostly because of like punk and Robert Mapplethorpe and Patti Smith and the Ramones and CBGBs and and even Warhol and the Factory. Like it all just the grimy churn of New York City just really always had this mystique for me that is so absent now. I mean, to talk about it is a cliche, but that's every city now. To talk about the way a city used to be is true of every single city in America now.
Even the New York of Sex and the City seems to be gone.
Yeah.
And then a lot of people complained about the New York of Sex and the City at the time. Like it was like this glossy version of what had come before. And I think there was something really magical about like the really dirty, post Son of Sam New York that was, it was a real gritty city. And like what was cool about it, and I think portrayed in movies about New York, is the highbrow and lowbrow at all moments. Like there's, people sitting at a restaurant with like pearls and they look like weird aristocracy. And then the scene that gets them there is like sitting with this cab driver who's like smoking a cigar. There's so much, there's this texture of New York that I think Ghostbusters really gets. One of my friends who's a police officer, he told me one of the cool things about being a cop is that you go in one day, you can go through all levels of society. Like he could start his morning in the projects looking at a body and then end up interrogating somebody in a mansion later that night. Just the way the day can go. And I think Ghostbusters does that a little bit. It goes from the New York Public Library to academia to, basically the small business that's basically a bunch of plumbers pretty much. And then it gets into the street level in New York, and there's people yelling back and forth at each other. And then there's extremely rich people, but there's also like working people. Like when they first shoot the proton packs off and it destroys the lady's like housekeeping cart. She's like, "What the hell are you doing?" Like there's these great New York characters, and I just don't know that you would get that anymore in a film.
Yeah,
You're definitely not getting that New York.
No, that New York is gone forever for sure. But it's also New York. This movie depicts New York as a collective idea, which is interesting because this is essentially at the end, it's the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man versus New York City, like a classic monster movie.
Yeah.
And now all movies over a certain budget seem to be about that, whether it's New York City or Metropolis. It's about some overwhelming force that just mows down buildings thoughtlessly. But there wasn't a lot of that yet in the early to mid 80s, other than King Kong and Godzilla. There wasn't a lot of movies about destroying the entirety of the economic center of the United States. I mean, it's definitely also partly a post 9/11 thing. Is we're just like obsessed with the destruction of New York City, which is really fucking weird. I just don't get that.
Yeah.
Like to replay it over and over. And obviously replaying it over and over is a way of like, well, in the movies we win. In the movies, someone comes and destroys New York City and then we get them.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's sort of like the Rambo thing. Like we can win Vietnam in the movies. We can win 9/11 in the movies. But going back over that trauma constantly is very peculiar to me.
Yeah, it seems like it would be pretty difficult. Well, I don't want to say difficult, but I wonder when we'll start seeing like retro, that type of New York movies. You know what I mean? Like I could see there being like a really great stylish version of Patti Smith's Just Kids getting filmed, you know, that really kind of captured dirt in the streets and all that stuff. I mean, the closest you get to it is in the second season of Stranger Things, like the squad of like kids.
Oh, yeah.
It has like a very, almost more like a Watchmen version of
it.
it.
The Deuce, the show on HBO, is about old, grimy, shitty New York, dangerous New York.
Is it worth watching?
I don't think it's a great show, but the like art direction, the New Yorkness, I think is great. Like to watch it and absorb that, the streets of New York is very interesting. Yeah, well, I think what's interesting about the New York depicted in Ghostbusters as a victim of an assault versus the New York of anything in the MCU where New York is under assault is that at a street level, you see people and faces and characters reckoning with, recoiling from, coming together against. There's a little bit of that in Ghostbusters 2, that we're going to get New York City to band together against this big bad. Whereas in the MCU, it's just buildings. It's just, it might as well be like the old Godzilla movies where it's just a guy in a costume and he knocks over a cardboard box and that was a building and there's nothing personal happening. There's no street level grime, and Ghostbusters is that. Like these are people and they're weird and quirky and have a lot of character.
Yeah, and the threats, and you know, obviously the whole city could be destroyed. I guess in the first Ghostbusters was like the concern that this extra dimensional portal opens up. It's kind of, I never even just thought about this for the first time. Probably is like they're not ghost busting; they're interdimensional demon busting. At the end of it, you know, it's
it's true.
It was kind of funny, and it's like their gear doesn't really play ghost rules anyway. You know, you're not like banishing people out of bodies, or you know, there's a possession, like Dana becomes possessed, but they don't really ever exorcise her. They just destroy the portal that's causing her problems.
Right.
It's almost like a Stargate sort of. It's like it's actually more science fiction than paranormal.
That's true. It's more Tomorrowland and less Haunted Mansion.
Yeah.
I think it just also occurred to me the way in which I think I brought this up on the podcast before, but for the most part, the MCU movies don't resonate with me at all. Whereas the TV shows do. And I think it's that the TV shows, Luke Cage defending Harlem. It's about him walking down the street in his hoodie and people recognizing him and having an opinion about him, and you see their faces. Daredevil is different but same. It's like it's about a neighborhood. Jessica Jones, she is a person in a place in a city.
Yeah.
Whereas the MCU, it's just faceless citizens.
Yeah.
They basically don't exist, and they're just at the mercy of this cosmic evil. And I think for me, when the scale gets too big, I just check out. Like I care about John Wick and his dog. I don't care about the fight for the safety of the universe and how it's going to be saved by 5 people and punching each other, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the New York of Ghostbusters is also the New York of Stan Lee at his best. To me, like street level Marvel is always the most compelling. It's like it's what like the new Spider-Man is just excellent because it's like a kid going to school and zapping himself around Harlem.
Absolutely.
Especially the new animated Into the Spider-Verse is phenomenal. And it's about New York, even though it's interdimensional. It involves just like, I don't know, 30 blocks in New York. And there's something really cool about that. And there aren't really many other cities that can really pull that off. You know, like in The Big Lebowski, probably if you're playing our drinking game, I'm bringing up The Big Lebowski, probably a good time to take a shot. In The Big Lebowski and also Chinatown, LA is a character, you know, and all the peculiar weirdos that you run into LA. But it's so spread out, it doesn't have the kind of like compact layeredness, which makes New York in some ways almost feel like a spaceship. It's its own like weird environment. And, you know, there are people who live and die even to this day in New York that don't really go beyond the borders of New York. Yeah. It's pretty weird.
Speaking of the drinking game, I have a feminism to itch. So take a shot. Here we go. I would say I have a problem with Ghostbusters because of this, but I want to go back to Venkman as a sexual predator. Mm-hmm. The first information we get about him, before we even see him on screen, is some ostensibly woman has tagged his door like Venkman is a creep or something like that. And then we cut to him inflicting pain on some innocent male student in order to manipulate and win the affections of one of his students. For the record, I don't actually have issues with students and teachers sleeping together or getting married or whatever. People can do whatever the fuck they want, but not in situations of manipulation and abuse of power, which I think is super fucked up. He does not take no for an answer from Dana.
You have to be hot for teacher. That is part of it, right?
That's part of the equation. Yeah, that's true.
You have to have it bad, have it bad, have it bad.
That fucking video. I watch that video a few times a year. I can't believe that fucking video.
It's great.
It is compelling and so evil.
It's amazing. It is everything great about the 80s. It's like when in The Wrestler, when Mickey Rourke is like, man, Kurt Cobain came and ruined everything. That's everything that he's talking about.
Okay, I mean, I could go on about Venkman, but I think I've spoken my piece.
Yeah, I mean, there's like it's weird, like, okay, for sure, as an office mate in today's times, he doesn't get away with it, right? Yeah. But as an early 80s, like, character that's supposed to be, like, good with the ladies or wins them over, like, he's consistently shown as successful in the film. So to me, it's more like he's like a pickup artist type dude, which you can make a case for that being like a sexual predator. But
oh yes,
written into the film is that there are moments where as soon as Dana starts seeing him on TV and being interviewed, she becomes more interested in him as he's like demonstrated by society as being more of a success. So there's like this kind of like this trope of like, oh, he's the bad boy, but he's successful. The Venkman issue becomes different style issues to the film. And like in one level, he's like the Pepe Le Pew character, just constantly pursuing in this cartoonish universe. But then, you know, we talked about, I think off mic, that he shows up and does the right thing when Dana's possessed. He doesn't sleep with her when he could. So it kind of shows that he's actually at heart like a decent guy.
As if it's somehow noble not to like rape someone when they're not in full use of their facilities. How noble that he didn't take advantage of this woman when she was possessed by a demon.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
That's a low fucking bar to clear.
But I don't know. But at the same time, like, I mean, how many people would probably sleep with her if she was a demon? You know,
assholes.
Yeah. or Satanists. Who knows? You never know. They make.
We'll cover that on the next episode.
This is my chance to hook up with a demon. Like, you'd probably be pretty stoked.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, and who's to say Dana's consciousness deserves that body? It's just like demonic.
What?
It's demonic gentrification, man. Dude. Like, she can no longer afford to be in that body. It's Zool's body.
What just happened?
I don't know. I mean, why would you want to date Zool?
But in his pocket at that time,
Thorazine.
Why?
Yeah.
Why is this man walking around with Thorazine in his pocket so that he can knock his date out?
Well, it reminds me of like really old movies where somebody was like a psychologist or a doctor and be like, "Is there a doctor in here?" And they come over and be like, "Here you go, little lady. I got something for you." Like, it's like an old...
I just happen to have my stethoscope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like... And I wonder, like, I don't really know any doctors, so I don't know if like they walk around like ready to be able to do whatever it is that they do at any moment. But I imagine, like, if I was a doctor, I might have like a little med kit in my car.
I think if I was a doctor, I would just walk around like, "No, I'm not a doctor. Don't bug me."
Yeah.
Oh, someone's dying. I'm not on the clock.
I think that's part of the Hippocratic Oath, though, is that you're supposed to stand up and take it on.
What's the stuff you give to Narcan?
Narcan.
Yeah.
So many people carry that now. My cousin, he's a cop in New Orleans, and he, or Metairie actually, which is the city outside. I'm sure he would prefer me to say that. And he says that like every single first responder now has to have the Narcan kit with them because heroin has become so bad that they.
I have it at my bar.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
it's everywhere.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Has anybody had to use it at your bar yet?
Oh, I use it all the time.
Just on people? Just
on myself when I'm bored.
You spritz a martini glass with it for a little extra buzz. Like, we make bitters out of Narcan. It's actually quite interesting.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's like some next level mixology nonsense.
Yeah, you like salt the rim of a glass with crushed up Adderall. It's just perfect.
What else we got about Ghostbusters?
We actually didn't really talk about the new Ghostbusters too much, even though we swore that we wouldn't. We didn't really.
Do you have something to get off your chest, Chad?
No. I'm just, it's interesting that a lot of the conversation around the original Ghostbusters, and we're doing it right now, involves like the failures of the remake.
Sure.
And this is mostly what I want to say is that like I'm usually can get through pretty much any movie I sit down and watch.
Yeah.
I could not make my way through this movie.
That's how I felt about Ghostbusters 2.
Yeah, but Ghostbusters 2 is also not good.
Yes.
It's a movie that was pretty much made to sell toys. And it has a really stupid logo with like the 2 finger in it and stuff like that, and it's just goofy. Although the Vigo the Carpathian as a character is, in my opinion, great. I think that's a great idea, and I've seen people do that as a costume. They just have the painting in front of them, and they have their face through it. Pretty hilarious. Oh yeah, it's great.
Oh, that's pretty funny.
Yeah, I just think
it's funnier than anything in the movie.
Yeah, like
no. There was one good joke. I was so bored by that movie, and I might have missed a joke at the end. But there's one moment where the Titanic pulls up to New York, like it docks at New York, and all these ghosts are marching off of it. And Cheech Marin of Cheech and Chong is one of the dock workers, and he turns to the guy next to him, and he's like, "Better late than never."
Yeah,
which I laughed really fucking hard at that one.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good gag.
I think maybe like one of the things, I think the script is mainly the big problem in the remake. Like I think that Feige or whatever his name is, Feig, he's the the writer, co-writer, director of it. And when you watch interviews with him, he just seems way too nice to be a director. Like he talks about how wonderful everyone is and how everybody was, like I just point the camera at people and their improv was just so great. I just wanted to keep going. And that's exactly how you get a bloated, terrible movie.
I don't know.
That's exactly how you get it.
I think you're painting the idea of this patriarchal notion of cinema directors and their dictatorial, I'm kind of joking, but actually I'm kind of not, that the way to good art or cinema is central authoritarian command. And that's definitely something, if we look at Kubrick, it's really easy to go like, see, someone who is a dictator and forces everybody to bend to his will, he will sculpt with sweat the perfect art, the unimpeachably perfect art. It's like, yeah, Yeah, that's what Kubrick did. Why would we want to privilege that as the way, as opposed to a director who's a facilitator?
Well, if you're talking about greatness, can you think of any like ultra collaborative, supportive, facilitating directors that have done anything really great?
But here's the thing: is we mostly know about auteurs because of how they're marked as auteurs, and so we go like, see, that's when it's best. But what we don't get is conversations about amazing movies that don't have this like cult of personality at the center of them, right?
Well, I mean, so what I would immediately think of is examples of successful films that are like very collaborative or improv-based comedy films, right? And
Yes.
so
Which the first Ghostbusters partly
it
was.
basically is, yeah. I mean, as I understand it, most of Bill Murray's lines are ad-libbed, and Dan Aykroyd, most of his lines are straight because he wrote it.
Fair.
Yeah, and so he obviously thought what was funny, but it's a lot of the writing is tighter, I think, in the original one, and there's
For sure.
it's just better editing too. I think like everything that happens in the first Ghostbusters that has the same beats as the remake, it happens in a tighter, faster way.
Which is funny because it's usually the other way around. Like
Right.
filmmaking has generally gotten faster, and oftentimes when we look at older films, it's hard not to notice that the pacing is slower. Whereas between the Ghostbusters, the newer one is like the scene was kind of over a while ago. Just for me, the whole thing about the remake is that it's not that, I want to be very clear, it's not that if you don't like it, you're a misogynist. It's more that, yeah, it was not a very good movie. Why is there so much fucking vitriol for this movie? It is so disproportionate for pretty much any remake I can think of. There's not as much derision. And it is not derision from everyone. It's derision from certain types of men.
It's not the worst remake ever made. You know what I mean?
No.
And so I think, but it has received the most backlash from any remake. And I think that that's a
Yes.
good point to make. But a couple things about the backlash is the more I learn about like fake Russian trolling, I have to imagine that a lot of this, like this, what was stirred up around this movie was stirred up by non-actors. Like, and also it got kind of, you know, the main political touch point for this film was the back and forth between Leslie Jones and Milo Yiannopoulos, but basically ended in him being deplatformed from Twitter. And then, you know, it was a consistent string of abuse, I guess, is Twitter's reasoning for removing him. But, you know, ultimately what got the radar was he wrote a pretty straightforward review of the film from the perspective of somebody who didn't enjoy it at all. Like if you read his article about Ghostbusters, not his tweets where he shits on everybody and says Leslie Jones looks like a man, all that shit is offensive. But his critique of the film itself is really not much different than other people who didn't like the movie. You know, he just said it was kind of bloated and unfunny. And
I guess for me, another thing is that the concept, like we're going to do Ghostbusters with women, I think is a great idea.
I think it's a good idea too.
Unfortunately, it's revolutionary still, I guess, because it
Yeah.
certainly makes people mad. But like, great idea, great take. Like, why would you? I mean, I think remakes obviously have a problem for the fact that they exist at all.
Yeah.
But if you're going to redo something, do it differently and honor the original material, but do something unique to it. And having an all-female cast is a really interesting, unique take. And it seems that so much of the bile directed towards this film actually starts from, I hate that idea.
Yeah, but I don't think that was as present as people made it out to be. I don't think people were like, Lady Ghostbusters, no fucking way. I think
I
some
disagree. I
people
feel like
were,
that was...
but I think like, have you ever talked to somebody in person who felt that way?
I mean, everybody I know loved the remake, so I don't know.
What?
I've never talked to someone. I've never had I don't talk. It's not that interesting. It's not a movie worth bringing up. I think that everybody I've ever talked to about the remake has been like, yeah, it's pretty funny.
Yeah.
I liked it more than I thought I would. Or
Yeah.
I liked it.
And that's kind of like, I mean, that kind of supports what I was going to say is I don't think normal people were so invested in the success or failure of this film at all in any way. I think most people did not give a fuck. And I think that the studio certainly whipped up the story around the criticism a little bit in its defense. Like
Sure.
you definitely saw
Oh, yeah.
people in the film being like, well, this movie, God, I mean, obviously people have a problem with women. And like, we're like, and it was like almost a blocker. Like I have in my life had conversations where people were like, oh, did you see the new Ghostbusters? Like, man, I couldn't get through it. I thought it was really not funny. And they're like, well, and I've been asked, you don't think female comedians are funny? Like, that's the next question. You're like, that's not what I said at all. Like, I mean, a nearly identically cast movie, Bridesmaids, I mean, same director even, is hilarious. I mean, and one of the reasons why it's so hilarious is Kristen Wiig is a great comedy writer, and she wrote Bridesmaids. I think if she had written this Ghostbusters, we wouldn't even be having a conversation about it being shitty. I think it probably would have been pretty strong.
Right.
I think just like it sounds like Sony Pictures is a bit of a dumpster fire, and like it's one of the studios that just gives everybody notes. So you talk about like the opposite of the auteur experience.
Right.
You have this yes man director with a whole bunch of people who he likes and admires and loves, and doesn't give them any real direction. A very weak script, probably too much money. I think we were talking. This is something else we talked about, like how genre films sort of need a limit to be good.
Yeah.
You know, like Thor Ragnarok, I think had like a reduced like budget compared to some of the other films, and it made up for it in writing and acting. You know, and I think that this new Ghostbusters, it's just too decadent. You know what I mean? It's a classic tale of like a bloated studio film with a bunch of chefs in the kitchen and ended up the way it is. And it's weird to me. I think like you thought about it, it's weird that it got so much flack. I think 5 years before, 5 years after, we wouldn't even be talking about this remake.
That's true. It would be.
Yeah.
I mean, I often think about the remake of Dukes of Hazzard.
Mm-hmm.
Who cares who asked for it? Why does it exist? I'm surprised I even know that it happened. But yeah, nobody even thinks about it. Although I guess Ghostbusters is a far more treasured material than Dukes of Hazzard. But
yeah,
the thing is, like, things come and go and people forget about them. But Ghostbusters, the remake, really, really made an impact on people's opinions.
Yeah, it's kind of like, too, like you think about the motivation for making a movie. Like from most of the things I've read, basically Dan Aykroyd and people, they still kind of like own big chunks of this movie, and they're like, let's make this movie. We want to turn this into like an MCU sort of thing. Was kind of the idea, was that there would be this big comedic Ghostbusters universe, and it would be huge, and there would be like an Egon movie, and there would be like, you know, whatever. And then basically this movie flopped so bad that it killed it. Like, it's done. And it's pretty like crazy to hear. You can go find this interview with Dan Aykroyd where they're like, well, what happened with this movie? And he's like, well, the director fucking sucks. He basically comes out and says it. He's like, we told him he had to shoot all these scenes to make it make sense. He refused to do it. We saw a cut of the movie. It was unwatchable. And then he had to spend another $30 to $40 million making those scenes that we told him to put in. So you're like, it sounds like it was just a mess, you know? But people, there were definitely people who were not willing to admit that it was a mess for like their own ideological reasons, I think. Like, you know, but even then, I think that's probably totally overblown. I think there were probably 40 people on either side of the debate that were like really seriously mad. And the rest of it's just bots.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's all I have to say about the new Ghostbusters. Yeah.
Do we have anything else to say about the original?
I mean, I was pleasantly, not surprised, but it was pleasant to find that watching it, still had like some magic to it. Like it still had some weight.
I think ironically, that's a good word for it. Like there's something about it. It has some magic. It does sort of like leap out at you, and it's got a really unique voice. Mm-hmm. It's also one of those movies, like, I mean, you brought up The Big Lebowski. I think that a lot of people would look at that movie of just like, yeah, that actor, that character, that moment, that script, it just did something. It just just made some magic. And
there are moments in it that are like legitimately, there's a creepiness to some of the scenes. Like I think the opening scene with the librarian could be you could recut that into a very scary feeling like opening. And then the scene where Ernie Hudson's character is just talking in the car and they're like smoking a cigarette and they're talking about how it could be the end times and it could be the apocalypse. At the time, at the 80s with the 700 Club on in the mornings and shit, that was a scary scene. The idea like, oh, what is going on? There's an apocalypse coming. And then you have real preachers on TV telling you the same thing. I remember that scene being very scary to me as a little kid, like just being like, whoa, like freaked out by it. Yeah, and like and the characters are great. Even like kind of, you know, Ernie Hudson's character that doesn't get a lot of credit for it being in the film. He's great. He's just a dude who just needs a job and is willing to do whatever, and he's there, and he sort of is an everyman. It's just such a cool feel. Like their banter at work feels real.
Is really solid.
Yeah,
it's true. All right, we have, before we sign off, got a piece of email. This email is actually about Suspiria, and it's from my friend Keith, who I think was mentioned in the Suspiria episode, and I'm glad he listened to it. But he said, and this email will only make sense if you heard that Suspiria conversation from that episode. So I haven't seen Suspiria, either 1 or 2. I know that horror is now in vogue, and I'm seeing Us this week, but I'm still more horror adjacent, following, but one step removed. Your description of the contortion, prosthetics, torture porn, body horror scene was really vivid. I resonated with the discussion of choreographer realness. Most dance movies suck at this with their dramatic tyrants. As Monique says, "No, not like that," or some accent. Let me put on my practice as research doctor hat, contact improvisation. And just an aside, Keith has a doctorate in dance.
He's Dr. Dance.
Dr. Dance. Is that true? I think it's true. Contact improv is to dance what non-penetrative equal power 70s lesbian sex is to sex. They are parallel developments responding to the same political and social tendencies or movements as non-competitive or cooperative games. They are hugely influential despite their failures, i.e., that they all become co-opted or adapted back into the larger flow of gender, competition, and hierarchy. Is contact improv the opposite of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Maybe, at least at the level of intention or goal. Contact improv is a non-gendered and non-competitive style or approach to dance only in moments and intentions. I'm an advocate for naming the power tripping and power exchanges and asymmetrical gestures bodies leadership, but only as a way to continually cycle back to a place where gender and power are unsettled or improvised with, like a jazz musician riffing on a recognizable standard, expanding its potential, not accepting its enclosures. Contact improv is a watery dance, flow and yielding, and two becomes one. But then it's animal play or child's power play with all kinds of micro-testing of each other's wit and strength. Although clearly, if a contact dancer actually tried to dominate their partner, it would seem inappropriate, rude, or worse, abusive. The sleazy shadow of contact improv is the mostly men, but also for sure some women, who use the hippie flow, all's peace and love, you could have said no mask to deny their manipulative or domineering desires, habits, or faults. Thanks for inspiring, Keith. So Keith is amazingly like deep in contact improv and what I think Monique and I were trying to evoke about like what that is in that episode. He's like, he literally has a PhD in this.
Yeah.
And so I think it's super fascinating. One more email. This email's from Stephen Intermill. He says, I was the curator of the A Christmas Story House Museum for years, so I got a kick out of hearing you both talk about the film. Not sure which episode, they all blend together. Anyways, I took care of Randy's snowsuit, Ralphie's Red Ryder, and all sorts of other memorabilia from the film.
This person is my fucking hero.
Oh my God.
Like, I'm so impressed with this.
But it actually gets better.
I know, I love Christmas, and this is my favorite fan letter ever.
Interesting way to make a living. He continues, I just left to operate the Buckland Museum of Witchcraft and Magic full-time, a museum dedicated to the collection of Raymond Buckland, the gentleman that brought Wicca to the United States in the 1960s. I can hear Chad groaning now. While I was putting it together, I had to tear down a drop ceiling, pulling up floors, hours of painting, hours of moving things around, personal injuries, rebuilding bathroom subfloors, etc. But it's all been worth it. Good percentage of the time I was listening to the two of you discuss films I was either familiar or not familiar with, and I appreciate it. Thank you for bringing me to Near Dark. What a great film. Down to the William S. Burroughs t-shirt. Thank you for writing that. That made me so fucking happy.
Yeah.
And God, I really want to visit you at that museum.
I know, man. I have no cause to go to that city. That's the only bummer. I was like, man, will I ever have a work reason to go there? But probably not.
I'll swing by on tour early next year.
Yeah, that would be a great photo op for the show.
For sure.
Yeah, it's pretty great. I mean, it's also like such a like an old Americana thing to do, to like having I mean, like the Warrens, you know, you have a museum of a thing that's in a town and people are compelled to go look at it and see what's up.
Yeah.
It's just such a cool way to go through life. And then, you know, I don't think I'd quite grown at Buckland's existence or the spread of witchcraft. But I definitely have some questions about the dude's motivation for
Buckland's
starting
motivation?
the whole thing. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's pretty
Hot goth chicks, maybe.
Man, if there's ever a reason, that's it.
Yeah. Speaking of which, we'll see you all next time for Hail Satan. Thanks for listening. Don't say cutting that the fuck out. No way.
Am I wrong?